Hi everyone, thanks for joining me for another episode of The Angry Doctor. I am Joel Keenan. I was talking to a friend of mine recently about one of the medications he's taking, a GLP-1 agonist. It's called GLP-1. Those are the meds that you're familiar with probably: Ozempic, Wegovy, Zepbound, Mounjaro, semaglutide, tirzepatide. Those are the generic names for them, that all have the same function. They promote the secretion of that peptide, GLP-1 it's called, which is responsible for doing a lot of things, but above all two. It slows down digestion, and it sends a signal to the brain saying you're full. It promotes satiety, feeling full. And as a result, lots and lots of people are fond of these meds and taking them to lose weight, and it's working for many, many people. 10% of American adults are on one of these meds. 20% of American adults have tried them. There are side effects that are really worth considering, including bowel obstruction, fecal impaction, pancreatitis, among others. Very common is nausea, as well as satiety, loss of appetite. So they're not risk-free meds at all. And a lot of people have tried them and don't tolerate them well. But my friend's point about this med was to say, not only had this worked for him, but he wanted me to know that it had really freed him from a vexing cycle he had been in, where for many years, even decades, doctors like me and nutritionists had told him time and time again that all he had to do to lose weight was eat lots of vegetables and get 7 hours of sleep a night and take little to no alcohol and get regular exercise every day, and there you go. That's your weight loss medication, a healthy lifestyle. And he was told this over and over again, and he found over and over again that those interventions did not suffice. And I was interested to hear this because I'm one of those doctors who has told people many, many times in my career exactly that. And it made me think about, to what extent people like me might be misunderstanding or underestimating the complexity of the situation. And I'll give you a couple of hypothetical scenarios to kind of flesh this out. Here are two hypotheticals that aren't true, and then I'll give you the third scenario that is true, but let's start with two that are not, because I think it'll help clarify what's at stake here. Suppose in 1900, 125 years ago, the obesity rate in the United States was 3%, and in fact it was. And then suppose 125 years later, today, it had increased from 3% to 8%, a small increase. Although the newspapers would report obesity rate more than doubles in the United States because they're looking at the relative, not the absolute increase. Anytime a study or a newspaper report talks about some new medical study that touts a 50% drop in risk for something or a 50% increase in something, always ask, compared to what? Is it the relative or the absolute change? Those are big, big differences. Anyway, in this hypothetical, let's say the obesity rate had increased in 125 years from 3% to 8%. What would be your inference if that were the case? Would you suppose that those additional people who had gained weight, that increased proportion of the public that had gained weight, that additional 5% of the public, had done so because of some ineluctable, intractable change in our culture, in our society, in our food supply, in our capacity to do exercise and lead healthy lives? Or would you say those people have a problem that they ought to try to solve because it's solvable? I think you would conclude the latter, because if it were a big cultural societal problem, that begs the question, what happened to the other 92% of the people who did not have this problem, who did not become obese? Okay, that's scenario one, hypothetical scenario one, where the obesity rate increases from 3% to 8% in 125 years. And my inference from that would be Those people who gain that additional weight have a problem that they need to solve, and it is not because of a systemic kind of culture-wide problem, okay? Second scenario. Suppose the obesity rate had been 3% in 1900, as it was, and 125 years later, today, instead of rising to 8%, had risen to 88%. In other words, almost everybody in the United States was now obese, where 125 years ago, that was not the case. What would your inference be then? Mine would be something happened culturally, systemically, in agriculture, in lifestyle, in how we live, in what we eat, that had made it almost inevitable that people were going to become obese. And certainly what I wouldn't infer from that is that virtually the entire United States had lost its willpower, had decided to live on Twinkies, had given up on exercise and healthy food, and just decided to get fat. I wouldn't infer that. That just seems phenomenally unlikely. Something must have gone wrong, other than with respect to how individuals chose to live. Right? Okay. So those are the two scenarios. And in one, it's pretty clear it's not a cultural problem, and in the other, it's pretty clear it is. But here's the third scenario, and this one is real. Suppose in 1900 the obesity rate was 3%, and 125 years later, today, it's not 8% and it's not 88%, it's 40%. And 3/4 of us, by the way, are overweight, not obese, but heading in that direction. 3/4, 75% of adult Americans. Now what do you infer? You know, every few months I read an article in the Times or whatever saying, oh, well, there's this new GLP-1 or some cousin of it coming out, and the comments are always the same. You'll get a bunch of people saying, I started this med a year ago or 6 months ago or whenever, however long it's been out, and it has completely changed my life. I've tried everything and only this has worked. And thank God for these meds, because there's just no other way I could have done it. And then there's a whole other set of comments responding to those comments saying, you know, if you just did A, B, C, D, eat a lot of vegetables, get vigorous exercise every day, get 7 hours of sleep, don't drink alcohol, minimize stress in your life, eat healthy food, you would not need these meds. And you know, there are two camps in these comment sections, and they're inevitably at odds with each other. Nobody reaches any understanding, and on we go. And that's really where we are today. And you know, I think my friend makes a good point. I think it's not a black and white picture in either direction. I don't think our overweight and obesity problem in the United States is strictly a problem of individual choices that can be made in the direction of attaining whatever weight you want, a healthy weight presumably, or on the other hand, that we're all screwed and there's nothing we can do about it. And it is the degeneration of our agriculture and our lifestyles and what is inevitably a sedentary lifestyle for a lot of people because of constraints. You know, there's no question, as you know, if you eat healthy food and you do enough exercise, you can weigh whatever you want. That's absolutely true. But how many hours of exercise a day would that take? That's a different question for different people. And you know, my friend, in having this discussion with me, sent me a copy of a paper that just made the point that different people have different baseline levels of that hormone, GLP-1, of that peptide. So, you know, if two people with identical blood pressure, identical height, identical weight, eat the same apple, one of them is going to convert more of that fructose and sucrose and glucose into triglycerides, into fat, than the other one is. People are simply different, including with respect to how they metabolize food. Yes, you can't violate the second law of thermodynamics. That's true. but we are more than a thermodynamic machine. We're an endocrine system. We have all kinds of influences, our microbiome, all kinds of things that affect, for better or worse, how we metabolize food and how much fat we store. And it really is different from person to person. And I think looking at that change in 125 years, that stunning change from 3% obesity to 40% obesity, just a disaster from a public health perspective. I think what that change suggests is both things are going on. One is we've lost sight of how to live healthy lives, and there are a lot of things militating against it. The work people have to do, the lack of sidewalks. Here in the state of Maine, it drives me nuts. If you go for a walk, you take your life in your hands. It's such a shame. It's so if public policy were better in the United States, we could do so much to improve our health just by making reasonable exercise more feasible for people, as well as, you know, developing communities where home and work are within shouting distance of each other, things like that. There are a lot of things in the U.S., as you know, that make it really difficult to live healthy lives. And I think what's happened is, over the course of the last century, while you and I have been alive, these changes have unmasked and exposed people who were more predisposed than others to gain weight when they didn't want to. And 125 years ago, those people had the same inclination, the same predisposition. There's been no genetic shift among humans in 125 years. That for sure has not happened. It doesn't work that way. But those people a century and a half ago, had the same predilection for overweight and obesity, but the lifestyle then was sufficient that that tendency wasn't revealed. It wasn't exposed. And now it is. Because there's so much more unhealthy food around us. It's so much more difficult to eat as well as we used to a century ago. It's so much more difficult to be as active as we were back then. So, you know, like a lot of things, I think it's a mixed picture. And I mention this in part because, you know, in my own experience, in my 60s, I've just been astounded that I'm more active now than I was 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. I'm less busy in my career because I'm not doing inpatient work, I'm just doing outpatient work, so it's easier for me to get sleep at night and not work as many hours so I can take better care of myself. And with all that, I'm getting fatter. I'm having more and more difficulty removing that axial fat deposition that every time I look down when I'm on my Peloton bike, I can't believe it. And it seems like no matter what I do, there it is. And you know, I think that's true for a number of reasons. One is that as we get older, our metabolic balance shifts towards forming fat and not muscle, as you know. You know, in men, testosterone declines gradually. Women, their hormones go off a cliff with menopause, and it's just brutally difficult for postmenopausal women. But for men and women in their 50s, 60s, and beyond, it only gets harder to build muscle and remove fat. That's just the way it is. So I think we got to give ourselves a break and understand that. And that doesn't mean give up the fight. Don't do that. Exercise and eat healthy food. And by the way, don't do it to lose weight. Do it to be healthy, regardless of what your weight is. Do it for that. It's so good for so many things, avoiding heart disease, dementia, depression, all kinds of stuff, as you know. Fight that good fight and do that no matter what the scale is telling you every day. And do the best you can. And I thank my friend for his insight. I think he made a good point. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you're enjoying this summer. I'll talk to you soon. Take care.